Well, thanks to Brian, we have a guest who actually works in the. I don't know, Brian. It can be said we work in the real world, but who someone who works in the real world, not the talking with everyone in a consultative way, finding out what goes on in the real world, which I always find fun. We speak we. Anyways, I could go on, but I've dug myself into a strange rhetorical trap here. Why don't you introduce yourself, guest?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. So I'm Mike Skaife. I'm head of engineering at JLR, Jaguar Land Rover in the UK, as I don't know. Um, so I'm at a place called the Digital Delivery Centre in Manchester in the UK. So we essentially are JLR's digital software engineering DevOps hub up here in the northwest of the UK. Been here for about 5 years or so, building various software systems for JLR, as I'm sure we'll talk about in this session. My background personally, so I started out as a software engineer, different types, moved into sort of architecture, technical leadership, being sort of head of engineering here. So it was a brand new team, brand new capability for JLR 5 years ago, and we built it out now to being 100 or so different engineers, dev, test, SRE, platform, security, etc. Doing hopefully some interesting stuff. Talk to you.
And so it sounds like you're in a part of the company. I mean, exactly what I'm always interested in, where you write the software. I mean, you and the people that you work with, your group, you write the software, the custom software that JLR uses, right? I mean, which is that's great. You went from programmer to managing other programmers and the big thinking and things like that, which is always a topic on its own. So the first thing I was interested in talking about is, I've been around long enough to know at least that I have this kind of like naive understanding of the software that companies do. Like it's especially apparent in banking, where like in finance, there's all sorts of stuff they do. But my view of banking is just like I log in and look at my accounts and pay bills. And so like anytime I think about software, it's always that. And I talk with some of your peers, Brian, in your group, and they'll be like, Cote, that's such a small part of banking. There's so many other things that go. So like, what is like when y'all are working on like the software that JLR uses, like what is the software? Like, what does it do? How does it fit into what the business needs?
Yeah, good question. So I'll give you an overview of all the different software in JLR, and I'll talk about the bit that we specifically work on, I guess. So, I mean, obviously software is everywhere these days in automotive. So the car itself, is with software. So the most obvious part there is what we call the infotainment system, that sort of screen on your dashboard with your sat nav, Apple CarPlay, etc. Behind the scenes on the vehicle, if you like, there's obviously a ton of other software. So I think there's something like close to 100 different what's called ECUs or electronic control units on the vehicle, doing all sorts of braking systems, engine management, autonomous driving, cruise control, lights, brakes, everything's kind of software controlled these days, right? A ton of stuff on there. And actually kind of, your embedded software, your C++, stuff, the real hardcore stuff. Around the vehicle, so you've got mobile apps. So if you buy a fancy Jaguar or a Land Rover, you get a mobile app with the car that lets you use various connected services. So you can, lock and unlock your vehicle remotely. You can set the temperature while you're having your breakfast and warm up or cool down your car while you're eating breakfast, all important stuff like that. And then you've got kind of, various systems, I guess, customer-facing web systems. So obviously you can buy a vehicle online, you can configure a vehicle, buy your finance deal, all that sort of stuff. We've got, a service where you can buy a vehicle on a subscription basis, for example. There's various kind of, again, connectivity around, connected services like the app I talked about. There's various APIs around the vehicle that can sort of do various features of the vehicle. We can send software updates to a vehicle, which is one of the areas we work on, so I'll talk about in a second. Then there's other stuff you don't think about behind the scenes again. So like manufacturing plants, again, all software driven, right? Robots, manufacturing systems, all the scheduling of that, massively complex, all software driven. Other kind of business HR systems behind the scenes as well. Design uses software. Vehicle testing increasingly uses software. So rather than smashing physical cars into a wall, we try and use some software to do that in virtual.
That seems like an improvement.
That's fun. But improvement. Labor, less expensive. Yeah. So it's everywhere essentially, right? And there's sort of like finance systems, all sort of usual business software. So the bit where my team specifically fit in, it's essentially what's called off-board web systems, essentially. So we're not doing the software on the vehicle itself. We're doing the stuff around it. So we do a lot of APIs and connectivity. So that mobile app that I mentioned, we do the manage the subscriptions and the APIs that will provision those subscriptions on the vehicle. You manage that system that allows you to buy a vehicle subscription. So rather than, purchase or lease a vehicle, you can sort of pay a fixed subscription fee, but kind of all in deal with insurance breakdown, etc. You can manage that. Big enterprise API platform, and then something called SOTA, which is software over the air. So that's a software platform for sending software to a vehicle, bit meta. But we're involved in that side of things as well. Various sorts of web systems like that, essentially. So web apps, cloud, that's our sort of sweet spot. And then, yes, again, we're not the only engineering team in JLR, of course, there's other teams also. There's teams building that onboard software itself on vehicles. Most of that done in-house, some of it's done by partners, for example. But yeah, that's kind of the sweet spot where we fit, I guess.
Yeah, I'm always, as a connoisseur, I was joking earlier about the fun world that we live in. Like I'm always curious about like what digital means, right? It means different things in different domains. But as you're going through like what your group works on, it seems like there's kind of two things. One, like digital means like, imagine things that are sort of like, let's say manual. I guess that's the opposite of digital, or analog, right? But like kind of analog manual things. And imagine like replacing them with software. And then on top of that, like if we do that, like you can think about the different sorts of new things you could do. Like, for example, you might have like, again, with my layman thing of thinking of things, you might have like power windows, right? Which is a very analog manual motor to put in somewhere. But if you made those more like digital and software driven, you might, I don't know, this is a dumb example, but now these power windows can do a dance, right? Like you could actually send the software over the wire to do things more complicated, which I think is like, that's one of the more interesting, I don't know, maybe the most interesting like meaning of digital is like we're using like the fungible, agile nature of software to like change how things work, right? Beyond just like, I can make this character bold, right? That to actually like change day-to-day activities and make them more interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. We use software to improve the vehicle over its lifetime. It used to be in the past when you'd buy a car and that was it. You're stuck with it for life. But we can now use digital and software to actually improve that car over its lifetime. The best example of that one is where our first electric vehicle, the Jaguar I-Pace, we've got a racing team in Formula E, electric racing series. So that's all sort of software based as well. And the racing team there made some software tweaks on the racing car to essentially extend the battery life or improve the efficient battery. And we were able to then translate that change to the systems on the I-Pace road car and send the software update over the air to essentially improve the battery efficiency of a road car after someone had bought it, which is pretty cool, right? So we can actually move these things over the power of it.
Yeah, or like living in Amsterdam, the car I have now, I just need to get the English version of everything on the dashboard. That would be nice to get over the air. I mean, just a very simple thing.
Well, that's so platform to see it. So we can sort of switch on and off features remotely as well, right? So a good scenario there is imagine you've got a vehicle rental company like Hertz or Avis, for example. You've got a fleet of Jaguar and Land Rover vehicles. You can configure those per customer, so you can sort of enable and disable features, charge a bit extra to enable heated seats, etc. Right. And actually do that through a software configuration over the air as well. So the power of it is quite immense. The flexibility it offers you and the possibilities it offers you going forward is pretty impressive.
Yeah. That really helps with manufacturer as well, right? So that you're building the same car or many similar components, but you're just reprogramming the software either at time or remotely. Presume as well, there's big challenge as well. When you think about those electric windows, it's not just some software from Jaguar that are deciding that when you push this button, it goes up and down. You're going to have components from Bosch and other manufacturers tying that all together. So you have all the same problems that you'd see, like we see in the enterprise of older software talking to newer software, APIs, abstraction layers, and everything in between. Is it the same for Jaguar as well?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's very, very complex. The vehicle's massively complex. Like I say, I think there's something like 100 different ECUs in the vehicle. It's something like that. A lot of them are built in-house, actually. We're quite lucky in JLR that a lot of it was bought in-house a while ago. But yeah, there is still components from Bosch, LG, other partners, etc. And getting them to interact and talk to each other. And I think dependency management, that's the biggest challenge, right? So when I talk about sending software updates over the air, so say we're going to update one of those modules over the air, there's a massively complex world web of dependencies and things, compatible versions, etc. That's very, very difficult to manage. So yeah, it's very, very complex. To understand which ECU works with other versions, etc., what's compatible, what's not, and trying to coordinate that in such a way that we don't obviously brick someone's vehicle. That's the worst case scenario. So there's a lot of complex dependency management. We have what's called a digital twin that we use, which is a kind of, I guess, big database, big representation of all the different software on each different vehicle. Again, what version is compatible with which, etc. So it's a bit of a complex thing. It's not like I just firing software out like you would with maybe, you can't tear it down like a Kubernetes pod and spin a new one up. A bit more complex than that.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point you raised, Brian. Like it's I mean, this is a discussion for another time or here or whatever, but like it is maybe one of the key defining things of, like, let's call it enterprise software, both like for office work, so to speak, but also, as we're describing here, for like industrial things, is like at some point just managing your dependencies and everything you work with becomes almost a huge part of your job. Like, just like if you want to forward something, like it's hard to, like, going back to my now silly analogy, you just want to update the power windows, and next thing you know, you're worrying about like how the tire pressure is checked, and like this doesn't really make sense on an ideal whiteboard, but at some point it made sense, which becomes complicated. And so like going to a slightly different area, but definitely in that area of dependency management, right? So like I find that in manufacturing of any type, there is like there's this weird situation that comes up in my head. So one, in manufacturing, like, I mean, it's literally like there in the word, you have lean manufacturing, which, again, from my naive understanding, is sort of like one of the better ways to do manufacturing versus other ways. And a lot of what we've been doing in the past, let's see, I always have to remember what year this is so that I can modify this. But in the past, like 20 years or so, like, we in the software world have been trying, I think, genuinely, sincerely, very hard to like learn from lean manufacturing and the way that it works. And, I'm often curious in manufacturing organizations, like how that's going for the software people, right? Like how the application of lean think kind of manifests itself in the software world. Because in theory, people working in software and manufacturing companies would be familiar with it. And, you might just run to someone in the cafeteria who's like, oh yes, I'm a triple jujitsu black belt of whatever, so I'm here to answer your questions about it. But how do you apply like lean think to the software process?
Good question, Phil. Yeah, and they are two very different worlds inside JLR specifically. I think if you go to one of the manufacturing plants and you ever get a chance to do that, it's quite mind blowing, the automation there and the process there. It's incredible to see it in action. And yeah, some of the cultural aspects as well. So there's something called the and-on cord, where you can pull this cord on the manufacturing line. Anyone can pull it. If something's going wrong, everyone sort of mobs around an issue, review it, have a post-mortem, if you like, after the incident. All that sort of cultural stuff is there in the manufacturing plants. But in the digital world, the off-board software world, before we arrived, a lot of that wasn't in place. It was very old school, if you like. It was waterfall development, not agile, etc. It's kind of weird. Yeah, it's kind of weird how you've got those two worlds, because, like you said, there are plenty of people in the business who understand those principles of lean. Maybe haven't related them to DevOps and Agile specifically. They understand the culture side of it and understand how that benefits. But they're two very different worlds, I think. So I guess that's one of the roles that our team's played here, has been trying to sort of sort of drive some of that transformation to those similar ways of working, some of that similar culture in the digital as well. And it's tricky. So again, I don't know if it's a JLR specific thing. We've got a lot of people in digital who, have been here for 10, 15, 20, 30 plus years. They've never really known anything other than JLR software development. So there's been a bit of an education piece there. Then the sort of actual transformation work as well. So we've had to introduce things like CI/CD. That was a whole battle in itself, which we can talk about. Agile ways of working. Again, that's all quite new. And I'm sure we'll talk about how that ties in with some of the other processes like finance, etc. Support, it's very traditional dev support, dev test support, separate teams, separate parts of the process. All that needs to change as well. So yeah, the assumption from your perspective is right. Why is the whole business not working that same way? But for whatever reason, the software, the digital, the IT side of it was lagging behind, and you're still sort of going through that transformation. I guess part of my challenge is then, is trying to relate what we're talking about in that world to what they know in the manufacturing world, and how there's so many similar concepts and the core pathways. Like I say, that's the trick to it, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Brian, tell me, like you, especially nowadays, like me, you talk with a lot of different organizations, right? And like, I wonder, like, there's that gap between like, here, lean thinking in the core business versus like, I don't even know how to express it, but the theory that I have, and this is what I don't know, I'm always looking for validation, but it'd be interesting to kind of like help shape the theory, is that I think historically, most organizations kind of think of software as like a supplier, like in the same way they might ask for like, we don't just need like the standard binder clip to hold our paper together. We need this special binder clip, but really I'm going to draw you a picture and I just need that binder clip and just deliver it to me, right? There's not sort of like a more sophisticated understanding, like a product management approach to binders clips would annoyingly be like, well, let's step back. What are you doing with these binder clips? But I don't know. It seems like a lot of organizations just think of software as like an off-the-shelf thing. And therefore, I don't know, they don't kind of craft this more agile way of thinking about it intuitively or something.
So to really milk your story about Power Windows, so I always love a good analogy, right? Especially when it gets silly. Like if you think about a power window, like in a modern car, as Mike was saying, you've got an ECU that's connected to a computer, there's dependencies, software that's programmed, it can be put in many different cars, but there'll be an engineer somewhere that just says, why can't we just have a switch connect to a motor that just drives that? And it'll be nice and simple. It'll be straightforward. It'll be easier to fix, easier to work with, easier to design perhaps. And it's only when you look at the full picture of, well, actually, that means we've got extra wires running into that door frame. That means that we've got more things that can physically break. It means that we've got a different switch in different cars, so it affects the manufacturing process. I think software is kind of the same. You need to have an appreciation for how software can fit together ideally in a business. Whereas I think because we use it every day in our lives, it's very straightforward. Think, well, we'll just make it do this, or we'll just do that. And I think that's the difference. I think businesses, especially say the last 5 years, have discovered that developing their own software, which on face value seems really complicated, right? There's massive value there. Because I think in the manufacturing industry, specifically around cars, like it used to be, we talked about 0 to 60 and engine sizes and literage and all that. Whereas now we're talking a lot more about the technology that's in cars. Because I'm working with some other automotives as well, a lot of my social media feeds and research is full of the younger buyers, not that I'm calling myself old quite yet, but the younger buyers that are now looking at cars and they're really upset that the navigation software is not as good as what's on their phone, right? So I think challenge of understanding that we can make new value through software, but appreciating that means that what we're going to build might be more complicated and there's more steps. And I think carrying people through that process might be challenging because we know a different way of doing it, right?
Yeah. I guess like maybe the way I'd clarify my foggy thinking when I was talking earlier is like, I guess from my perspective, and maybe from the perspective of the three of us, a lot of organizations think of software as just like some commodity thing. Like it's just like a supply that you buy. It's not something that you want to customize and specialize because you can to really like be part of the product that you're building. Just exactly what you were saying is like, a really good like software driven dashboard, like including the navigation and all this stuff, is actually like a really important feature. Like it's a new feature that didn't exist that becomes part of your product. So, and maybe that's where like I feel like a lot of the consternating, if that's a noun you can make into a verb, like happens is that like all of a sudden, if you as an organization want to treat software as something other than a commodity, you've got to give it the same attention that you would the other parts of your core business. And then as you're getting to, Brian, and then you discover the complexity of software, right? Which was easy to kind of hold if hold back if you didn't want to customize it very much.
And transforming people, right? That's always the most interesting part of all of these journeys, is that we can bring you software, we could develop all these things, we could hire lots of people, but we need to take everyone on that journey. And they're all going to do that at different speeds, universal across all the businesses I've worked with. I generally say, people say, well, I'm working with technology. A lot of the stuff I do day to day is actually just working with people and helping them understand what that might look like and be more empathic in the way that we approach that change.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can help us get, or at least me, get a little grounded here, Mike. I've stuck my head way up into the metaphor, like wacky zone. But as you mentioned, right, like I guess about 5 years ago, you were moving from a more waterfall way of doing things, right? Which I'll presume means there's a lot of upfront planning, like at least on a yearly, if not multi-year basis. You specify what you want on day one, and if you're lucky, you get exactly what you asked for on day 365, right? Which the clever way of phrasing that is like maybe you don't want it anymore, but whatever, right? Like. So you have that kind of long process. So what were what was first like the end state goal that you were looking for with being more agile, and like how did you sort of like what's the broad journey that it took you to get there? And then maybe we can hop into like the little obstacles and stories of each.
Yeah, good question. And Brian's right. The majority of it is people based as well. I will say that the software is the easy bit, right? So 5 years ago, so you're quite right. It's a very waterfall, 12 months funding to do a project, and then it's done. That's it. Give me some requirements documents, see you in 6 months' time when it's finished. Well, yeah, that's the classic world, right? That's what we walked into. In terms of end goal, I think there's probably a couple of things. So one of it was around quality of software. So making sure, we've got a real focus, like we were just saying a second ago, with software becoming more and more a crucial part of the business. Start treating it the same way we do as quality on our vehicles. We wouldn't send a half-built vehicle out into the world that's breaking all the time. We'd have the same attitude towards the software. So quality was one part of it. And I think speed was the other one as well, right? So again, because software is now everywhere, because software, as you just touched on there, is a differentiator these days. But to make sure that we can respond to change quicker, changing customer demands. That example I gave before about the sort of extending the battery life, being able to sort of make sure we can respond to those sort of things a lot quicker. So speed and quality, I think, probably the two main motivators. There's probably a cost thing in there as well, right? But I'm not one of those. Probably those two things. So in terms of the journey, one of the first things we went after in terms of bottlenecks, I suppose, what's some of the bottlenecks in the process that are stopping that speed at the moment? The main one being essentially getting things into production, getting things released. That kind of that release cycle, that lead time, whatever you want to call it. So we went after what JLR calls our change management process, which is essentially to get any software change into a production environment. There's a sort of 2-week, very governance-heavy process where you've got to sort of raise a ticket in a system. It gets reviewed and approved by 87 different people, 86 of who don't have any understanding what the change even is. Takes wages to get through that cycle. You've got to agree kind of downtime over a weekend. What's your rollback plan? But it's obviously the exact opposite of DevOps, right? So that's the first thing we went after, was how do we, if it's going to take 2 weeks to do a production release, it's going to sort of kill any attempt we've got to do there's agile ways of working, etc. Make sure we can sort of do it multiple times per day. So that's the first thing we went after. And again, the majority of that really was people side of things. It was convincing people about how this fancy new way of working we were talking about, just as good, if not better than the original process, how it still addressed the risk in the same way, how it was even less risky to do smaller, more frequent deployments, all that good stuff, using automation, etc., other vendor reviews, etc. That's the first thing we went up. That was the biggest thing, the biggest win, because that obviously that unlocks everything else, right? Once you can start pushing things to production whenever you want, it unlocks everything else, right? So building in quality, responding to demand, etc., etc. Yes, I'm rambling on a bit there, but I think, that's probably the biggest we went after. Yeah. And that helps improve speed, improve the quality, and we're built on that foundation from there, essentially. And by doing that, by sort of having that first use case and starting to push out some of our first few releases, we then earn that trust of people to say, actually, okay, these people know what they're talking about. And from there, we've been able to build on the sort of further change. But that resonates with you, Brian, but that's the main thing right there.
It's a great way as well of showing intent, right? So if people can see that you've made a real world difference in how quickly you can do something, all of a sudden, the rest of your plans might not seem so crazy.
Yep.
Yeah, and well, so I'm curious. Like a lot of what you mentioned was, well, not a lot of what you mentioned. Most of it was just releasing the software, right? Was difficulty, and does that imply that the actual like programming was kind of fine, or did the like application developers, did they also like need to change how they were doing things?
Okay, I mean, there's stuff around that, of course, that enables that automated deployment so far. So we're talking about things like automated testing that wasn't in place before either.
All right.
All that sort of stuff, right? Yes, just stuff that enables the DevOps release cycle. So automated testing, the CI/CD pipelines, all the infrastructure as code, other stuff that wasn't there as well. So it's all that other stuff that underpins the release process, if you like. The end goal was the faster release cycle. But yeah, to your point, Cody, there's some changes in the way we actually build the software, how we do the testing, the fact that we all do that together in one team. It's not handed off, built, tested by someone else, or by someone else. It's all done with that one team. There's that culture built around the building of the software. The end goal being release anytime.
So how much, like, well, at least in general, but in your direct experience, how much of the way people work day to day, whether it's in development or operations or like architecture, I mean, all the various roles that are associated with getting software out the door, how much do you think is driven by that pipeline? And not driven as in the pipeline does it, but driven by the needs of the pipeline, right? Like analogously, like you can look at the way a city is designed and you can say like, this city is designed around the technology of bicycles, or the city is designed around the technology of cars, right? Mm-hmm. And you're making me realize I've always been curious, like how the tool drives the culture, if that makes sense. And so like you have the goal, I want to put the CI/CD pipeline in place, and therefore, not only can we change things like having less manual reviews, which is great, but we also need to change these things to take full advantage of it.
Yeah, definitely. We think that's the approach we took, is we tried to use that to force the change out, not force the change, to drive the change elsewhere, right?
To reveal the benefits of changing, or whatever they were.
Once we started talking about partners, it became apparent we couldn't have a separate test team, we couldn't do manual testing, we couldn't have this governance process.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly that. I don't know if we consciously did that, but once we started talking about the need to deploy much more frequently, it kind of unearthed all these other blockers we need to sort of work on as well, if that makes sense. I don't remember the answer. Yeah. I've lost my trail of thought there a bit, Cody.
Yeah, well, like for example, like along the area there that I was asking on, it seems like one consequence for application developers is if you're going to be releasing your software every week instead of let's say every month. I mean, if you have your final release every 6 months, probably in development, you're at least targeting like a month to kind of like bring all your code together, whatever, right? You've got your own internal things. But once you reduce your release cycle to like a week, because you want to support like the CI/CD doing this, like it's obvious, but it has kind of profound consequences. Like you can do less each release, right? Like, so you have to force yourself to do less code, which sort of forces you, as the way you're operating as an application developer, to think in smaller chunks of functionality. I don't know. It has all sorts of consequences, right? And similarly, like I would imagine in operations, like if you're supporting a pipeline, like the way you do service request management has to change. I don't even know, right? But it's interesting to think about like what kind of constraints or what kind of motivations that you get when because you're using a CI/CD pipeline versus.
Yeah. Even like architecturally, for example, right? So beforehand there was massive monolithic applications. Now we've moved to a more microservice architecture to change things more independently, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
All that sort of stuff that, like I say, as mentioned, automated testing, that's the same thing. If we're going to release it quickly, we should be able to test it quickly. So we can't suddenly have big manual test scripts that we can work through step by step. It's got to be automated and much more quickly. All that sort of stuff comes off the back of it. You're quite right. The service management piece is another interesting one because again, this is where perhaps we're a little bit separated from other parts of JLR. JLR's got its sort of traditional IT help desk, and we kind of sit on the back, but that's very much, ticket driven, manual driven again, and we kind of hang off the back of that with our instant process. So that's my next area to go after and change. Actually, is how we can sort of integrate more closely with that. But yeah, you're quite right, Coach. It's driven some changes in the way that we work in terms of building the software, but the way that our stakeholders that we work with think about it as well, right? So like I said, they can't suddenly come along with a big requirements document and say, see you in 6 months. We need that engagement as well, right? It's got to be, we need to talk to you on an almost daily basis as well and get your feedback and make sure you're making the changes in the right way. So the people side of it as well as the tech side changes off the back of that need to release quickly to production, which is why that was the first one we went after. That's the enabler for everything else, I think, is getting stuff out there quick.
Yeah. So you brought up a situation that I'm realizing connects to like this thing I've been not stressing out, but like, staring at the wall and thinking about. Like, so the one you brought up was that to phrase it in an experimental way. So we for reasons of quality and also for like speed of getting features out, so you have time to market basically. And then also what comes with that is like experiment's always a scary word in manufacturing, but we can try new things out business wise and see if it's a good business or not, right? We're not committed to like 10 years of something because we decided this thing in the whatever. So, but you can kind of refine and try out new business ideas. So you put a CI/CD pipeline in place so you can deliver things quickly. And as a consequence to that, as you were saying, like the way you architect your software has to be different. And like microservices ideas are a good fit for that because microservices is basically like, it's kind of like, to not go on and on about it, it's like having agility in your architecture by removing dependencies and kind of having smaller things. Now, with that same kind of like, it's almost like what's the idiom, a cart and a horse or a mule, like which one's leading which? And like, if I look over in the infrastructure space, I'm often wondering, like, I mean, here we are at VMware, we're big cloud native proponents, but I often wonder, like, can you do agile development because you now have cloud native infrastructure, or do you only do cloud native infrastructure because you want to do agile development, right? Like where does it come in first? And so like to that end, I'm curious, like when you move to this like shorter cycle, like what did it uncover about the way you ran your infrastructure and you did your release management and all that operation stuff? Like what did it require you to do?
Yeah, I mean, it uncovered a lot of stuff, right? Because I've mentioned things like testing there, mentioned the change manager a bit. There's then things like security as well. That's on the part we've not talked on yet. And then the infrastructure side of things. I mean, I think when we first wrapped up 5 years ago, there was the beginnings of some cloud infrastructure there, GC. But again, to get that involved, raising a ticket against the team, they'd spin some VMs up, etc. Obviously, we realized that wasn't going to work with Zyber, so that led us to then using things like Terraform infrastructure as code and provisioning that in an automated way as well. That's one thing you've got to cover. The security thing is important as well, because again, that's where you've got a traditional view of build a thing, do a pen test, be live. If you're releasing again and again, you need a different approach to security there as well. So that's where we started building things like vulnerability management in our pipelines, etc. How do we do more automated pen testing on a more frequent basis? Unlock things there. Then leads to who pays for this stuff. We've not talked about financial. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. That got all covered there as well. But yeah, it's interesting what came first, Agile or all that. I think they're both kind of hand in hand in that sense. We realized that, well, we knew from the start that we wanted to work in a certain way, right? We wanted to do Agile, wanted to do DevOps. And that led to us uncovering all these different parts of JLR that sort of didn't facilitate that at the moment and driving that change.
Yeah. I mean, I guess another way of like thinking about it, which I've been trying to ponder, is like, why couldn't you just like use what you already had? right? What was preventing you with like just the infrastructure and the process we've kind of covered, but like the tools that you already had such that you would want to try out new things?
Good question. Think about that one a second.
I think that's a really good question, because I think this is where I've seen a lot of enterprises stumble. And I think the answer is everything. Like, if you want to build a car by hand, you'd approach everything in a very certain way. Whereas if you want to build 10,000 cars in a factory, in a manufacturing line, your thinking is different, your culture is different, your design is different, your parts and management supply chain is going to be different. The way you put them together is going to be different. You're not going to start at the bottom and work your way up. You're maybe going to do different panels of 10 cars first. You're going to be thinking about your release strategy in terms of having batches so that you can see what's changed over time. So if someone reports a defect in a batch of cars, you can then make a change. Or back to Mike's, this concept, Mike's, where you've got this cable you can pull in the manufacturing process. And that's got a real bit of psychological safety in the workplace, right? You need to be brave enough to stop the manufacturing line to say, I think we've got a problem. Let's all gather around and fix it. And I think that's one thing we don't do well enough in software, but I won't get in that tangent just now. But I think, and sometimes it's where to begin. I think that's the nice thing about Mike's story, is that he found a place to begin and start, and then made changes. And we're still on that journey, right? It's going to be, we're not fixed yet. That's why we're still all in gainful employment, which is lovely for technology. Yeah, I think it's everything. Mike, what would you say?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's why, you're definitely right. We're still on this journey, right? I don't want to paint this picture that JLR is this perfect software house, because we're not. We've got a lot of challenges to fix still. I've mentioned the incident management side of things there. Yeah, I agree, Brian. I think it included everything. And the cultural aspect is really interesting to me. Let's talk about psychological safety. I believe that's something that we've tried to influence as well, right? Because again, there's an element of, when we had our first incidents or first few incidents, like, okay, who do I blame? Who do I sack for this thing? But we thought that we're going to take our time. It's a blameless culture. We're going to find the root cause. We're going to review it together and identify how it happens again. It's always a system problem, not a person problem, all that good stuff. That's another part of the journey we've not talked about yet, where, the tech is one part of it, and that's fine. But the cultural side of things has been probably a bigger challenge, but almost certainly a bigger challenge. Trying to change people's ways of thinking around, like I say, incidents, risk, security, testing, all that sort of stuff. Again, yeah, I agree. It's just pervasive, Brian. You're right.
So there's two sort of hurdles or bottlenecks that I wanted to talk about before we run out of time. And you just, one of them is as you keep saying, finance, which is great, because people always tell me finance is a problem, and I have no idea why. So it's always good to ask people. But the other one was changing how people work, or changing the culture, right? And then I think you're hitting on a nuance that I don't think about too much, is changing their perception, which is usually fear about something, right? That's something, their trust about something. But instead of me feeding you ideas, as I've kind of been allowing myself to do here too much, like what are those culture change problems? Like what are some of the issues that you faced? Because I often feel like if I went and read like a book on like just, generic agile software development, we could all agree it sounds great, right? Like we can all agree on this end state that we want to get to, but like getting there seems very difficult.
Yeah, there's a few cultural elements. So I think risk is definitely one of them. It was definitely a kind of real risk aversion in JLR around software changes, possibly driven by, being bitten in the past by big releases that have gone wrong, etc. If you're going to do releases all the time, that's quite scary. There's a risk thing there. And of course, the impact of some of the software changes as well, right? If you're talking about changing software on a vehicle, there's a lot of risk to that, right? What if that goes wrong and you break someone's car, or the braking system stops working, or, it can cause a lot of damage for that. So I understand the risk aversion in that sense. Another interesting part, and again, I don't know if this is JLR specific, is, I guess I'd call it siloed ways of working. So when we're talking about agile teams working much more closely together end to end, When you're going into a world where you've got, dev is here, test is here, release is here, but more support's there. There's lots of very, very siloed teams. So we've had to sort of change how those teams work together. We've built kind of cross-functional squads, to use another buzzword, of all those different types of engineers and different business stakeholders working more closely together than they have done before. I've mentioned a few times the idea of, we get a requirements document thrown at us, see you in 6 months. That's had to completely change, right? The relationship we've had between the digital teams and the different stakeholders from other parts of the business, that's been completely changed because, as I said, we need to work much more closely together. To your point about being a commodity, it's not something we can just chuck over the wall and get back when it's finished. We need to change that kind of operation. So that's a big. Those are probably the two biggest things. That kind of risk aversion and then the collaboration side of things. It may be specific to DLR because JLR is just such a massive organization with so many different silos, but I'm sure plenty of other people out there, large enterprise companies, see the same challenges, right? I'm sure Brian's seen a lot. Some people.
You're not alone. You're not alone.
How about you, Brian? Like, what do you see as like if we go like one or two, as Mike was doing there, if we go one or two layers below, like culture change is hard, like not only what, but like, why is it hard? Like to pick one thing that I think is good with the perspective you have looking at, as you were just, proving many different organizations, right? Like, so if you're changing the way that groups interact with each other or silos, right? Like, again, it seems like we can all agree that it would be better if we didn't have silos and we all work together. And yet, like, it's such a difficult thing to get people to change. And so, like, I don't know, why is that? Why is the status quo so powerful?
So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this because, like, change is really, really hard. And when we talk about it, we all just say change is hard. And trying to build a structure around it is where I'm spending a lot of time. So I think there's a couple of things. I think, first of all, been writing an article recently that you might recognize the subject of, about bottom-up and top-down change. So you did a great video series around bottlenecks, and I've been writing up some of the blog posts on it. Writing on coattails, what I do best. But in that, I've spent a lot of time really looking at what drives top-down and bottom-up change to fail or succeed, because I've seen both and I've tried both. So I think top-down change we all recognize mostly as a marketing campaign. So leadership decide we're going to have a radical change towards Agile. We're all going to go in lean training. We're all going to do this. We're all in Scrum teams now, and you're all going to love it no matter what. And that doesn't work. And then likewise, bottom-up change, it hits a limit of local optimization, because as you were saying, Mike, like you can build a fantastic system to take an artifact and put it into production. But unless QA are on board, or unless security on board, or unless these other teams are on board, you're going to be really limited in what you can achieve. And so I think the reason that change is hard is because you need a mix of that top-down and bottom-up, and they need to marry up in the middle. And that's not something I think many businesses are great at. I think we do one or t'other. We don't normally see those two things come together, because I don't think there's often a strategy up front to do that. So I think when I'm thinking about my experience building platforms and helping customers with product, I spend a lot of time talking about advocates. And I think that's really important. Like, you need to have people on the ground that are going to be advocates for what you're doing, why this change is important. And if we think about the bell curve of adoption for change, right? The diffusion of innovation curve.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. We'll see that the beginning curve, innovators, they just love new stuff. So they'll do it anyway. You've got this other huge section, though, which are basically pragmatists. They are going to adopt change as long as they can see value from it. And then, unfortunately, you've got the other half of the bell curve, which are people that are going to be resistant because they know what they're doing just now, and the change is really uncomfortable. And let's be honest, it's uncomfortable for all of us, but it's just whether you can see a value out of it. And I think that's what we need to do with change. We need to find a way of getting that first half of the curve on board and then helping the second half. But it's part technology, it's part process, it's part people. Again, change is hard because change is everything. So again, that's a rambly, need to put a blog post together mindset. But I think that's kind of what I see in the real world, is that we we just fail to meet in the middle sometimes.
Yeah. And you talked about this a few times, Mike, but there's the needing to prove that it's a good idea beyond an intuitive understanding of like, you have to prove that it's a good idea because essentially you have to like prove that it's worth the risk of it not working, right? And all the effort you're going to put in the position you're going to be in, which I think is, it's like all common sense. It sounds really obvious when you say it, but it's hard to actually put into practice. But speaking of like, so again, the last topic, speaking of resistance to change. So what is the deal with finance? Just like, give us an overview. How does finance help? How is it a bottleneck? Like what's the mismatch such that like, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, we were trying to move to speed up our software development process, and boy, finance was a big help.
No. Yeah, that's okay. So some of my finance colleagues may say this. So I think the biggest challenge I think I've seen with it is, I think about a lot, is that classic project versus product mindset. Finance want to fund thing for 6 months, it gets built, bosh, done. Whereas obviously the world we want to live in is much more kind of ongoing funding for products. And part of that I think is not necessarily knowing what you're going to get at the end of it. So again, if we move away from that world where we find set of requirements, here's my outcome, here's how much it's going to cost, done, to a world of, we're agile, we don't necessarily know what you're going to get at the end of it. If I'm a finance person, I'm going to think, right, you want me to give millions of pounds and I don't know what I'm going to get back at the end of it. That's a little bit scary. So I think it all tied back to that for me, I think, that kind of project versus product mindset. And that then links up with other things like, we talked about platforms a little bit. So the funding of a platform to underpin some of this stuff is very difficult from a finance perspective. If it's not tied to a specific project, a specific piece of work with a kind of very specific business outcome, it can be difficult to get buying for it, right? So that then talks to other things like, addressing technical debt, addressing kind of ongoing maintenance of products, etc. Again, unless you've got a specific stream of funding, it's difficult to sort of get that paid for. So I think it tied back to that. That's what I've seen in JLR, certainly, is if it's not tied to a specific project, it's difficult to kind of access that funding. And then that tends to, funding resourcing, funding software tooling, etc. All that stuff has to be tied back to the project. So I wonder if that kind of underpins a lot of it. Just switching that mindset again to being much more long-term product focused, and again, tied into risk, right? So the risk of you might end up spending a lot of money and actually get no benefit from it, but you'll learn something along the way. But to a finance person, of course, that's quite scary because that's just essentially throwing money away.
And so how do you, maybe my understanding of the following is incorrect, but how do you like square that with like, well, we just kind of got to like mess around and discover new things about cars, right? Like we don't really know what's going to result, but like we'll discover, kind of like what you're saying, right? Like if you were, well, I don't know, maybe tell me if I'm being too naive here, but if you're funding the what was the electric sports car, the E2, like racing, like if you're funding that, and then like you couldn't have really tied that to a project of discovering a better way to run the car. It just sort of happens. And you sort of know that like, well, we're in the business of cars. So if we spend a lot of time just driving cars and observe what happens, we'll discover things. Now, what that results in, I have no idea, but like will be something. So it seems like that, like finance is okay with that, maybe, but not with kind of what you're saying is like, we're going to build a platform and we don't really know what we're going to need to build, but we're going to need to build it. So could I just have some money for that?
You're right. Because it's the same as that point we talked before about how manufacturing and software are different, but they're using the same principles. If you think about a vehicle, we build prototypes, we design prototypes, they sometimes don't go anywhere. We throw money after that sort of thing. Yeah, it's the same sort of concept. Again, I'm not quite sure why that doesn't translate into the digital software world in quite the same way. You could spend millions and millions on a prototype vehicle and it never actually get released eventually. You might discover there's no market for it, or actually there's some engineering challenge along the way. It's the same sort of concept again. For whatever reason, that just doesn't translate into the digital world in quite the same way. We've got that same challenge there to sort of, you use it as an analogy. I really like that analogy of sort of relating back to lean manufacturing and using that. Maybe we need to use a kind of vehicle prototype thing as an analogy for the finance use case as well.
I think one of the things that I've seen time and time again is that the divide between finance and software delivery is a lack of understanding. I don't think that finance really understand IT, how it's built, why it's there sometimes, but specifically the mechanism of how we go about building it. So how you build a car with a prototype, etc. There's maybe a closer understanding. And as software people, I think we're terrible at understanding finance.
Absolutely.
So one of the best things I ever did was when I became a new manager of an engineering team, and I realized how out of my depth I was. I called up one of the young finance guys that was helping me with various questions, and I said, look, can I just sit down with you for an hour over coffee? And you can give me like a 5-year-old's guide to finance in this company, and I'll give you a 5-year-old's guide to cloud computing and why that exists. What platform as a service is, what platform as a product is, what we're trying to achieve. One of the best hours I've had. I learned so much. And we continued doing that, in fact, on a kind of monthly cadence, and it was really useful. And for me, it was the ability to understand why finance perhaps had some struggles with software teams. A couple of big ones that stand out to me. Number one is that we don't spend the money that we say we're going to spend. We either spend much more or much less. And ironically, we don't always understand that spending less is actually really bad too. Because if we've spent less money than we planned to, it's not like we hand it back like a savings account. The problem is that means that other parts of the business didn't get to do what they wanted to do. And the finance person now has a problem because now he's got a pot of money, but we said our stock price was going to be this, and the stock market likes repeatability. So if we're not on that line, that's a big problem. So there's a constraint on finance that sometimes the software we're unaware of. I think the other aspect is that we are terrible, absolutely terrible at telling finance what value we achieved. So I'd love to know what it's like in JLR, but in many of the businesses I've worked in personally and the ones I'm working with, you go to finance almost like the gatekeeper, the troll on the bridge, right, to try and get the money. You get your money, you run off with it, big, huge sack of cash, and you promise you're going to do good stuff in a year's time, and then you never really report back. But also, well, like the modeling that you've done is like, I need all the money and I'll tell you when I'm done. And again, one of the things I changed in my time was that I began to look at big, scary projects like building a new car, building a new platform. And I said, well, actually, don't give me the money. Don't give me all the money. I'm going to want this amount over the year, but I want this amount this quarter, this amount next quarter, and this, and so forth. And if I get to the point at the end of the prototype stage, I might actually come back to you and say, I don't want the money. Or I might come back and say, I need more. And having that type of conversation flipped things for me from begging for cash to actually being at Q3, kind of at that scary point for finance people. And finance would approach me and say, how much more could you achieve if we gave you some extra money now? And could you get it all receipted and invoiced in time for our timelines? And that's because trust has been built up and understanding. But what's it like in JLR, Mike? Is there a good system for reporting back to finance, or are they so busy with just trying to guard the cash in the first place that there's never really that cycle that happens?
Yep, it's option B, Brian, sadly. I think we're kind of missing that feedback, and that's the trick. We're in that first situation you talked about where we take the cash, run away, and we're very, very bad at reporting back about what we've done back of it. Or at least talking to the finance people. We're very good at kind of talking to business stakeholders about sort of value we've delivered and what the product does. But closing that feedback loop with finance is definitely a big gap. To exactly what we just talked about there, right? So what we want to get to is exactly that kind of quarterly model. Just don't give us it all up front. Just do it bit by bit. Do the feedback loop review. Do we need to keep going? Do we need to can this project? Have those discussions. But we're not there yet. That's the journey we want to go on. And I think that will help a hell of a lot. We're currently in the situation where we don't have that feedback loop at the other end to sort of close the loop and say, yeah, here's what we did, here's what we didn't do. Give us some more money or don't.
And it's a tremendous power out for finance, because all of a sudden you've turned that agile thing we're talking about being quite scary into being a fantastic tool, because now finance have an understanding that they don't have to spend all the money. They'll still get some value delivered along the way. They can pause a project. They can ramp up a project, all based on those outputs. So if you're doing really well and they've got spare money, great, let's double down. Well, actually, financial world has changed. Something else has happened at either macro or in the business itself. Right? We need to change our plans. Agile can help us do that. Modern cloud native practices can help us do that. Why monoliths have their place, but they're harder in that regard. But I think having that feedback loop is how we go building the trust, so we can actually demonstrate that this crazy world of we don't know what we're going to have at the end of it is better than waiting until the end and maybe building the wrong thing.
Yeah, you know, y'all are like, I like the points you're making, and one of them. So to add my bit to it, it seems like finance, maybe in respect to what we're talking about, wants three things. They want like to be as deterministic as possible, right? Like, you know, I mean, that's the way we all are with money. If I put, you know, 50 pounds over here, I would love it if one, it stays there and doesn't disappear. And then two, like it gives me a return that's known, like in the direction that I wanted, right? Like, and in corporate finance, it's even more so. And then two, like, I think Brian, you were hitting on this, is like, there's this expectation of repeatability, which is almost like being deterministic. Like, you know that this thing is just going to keep acting the same way and returning the same thing. And I think that hits on a little, you know, it's one of the reasons why not spending enough money is annoying, because if there's the opportunity to have made more money, you would have wanted this person to spend more, right? And you know, kind of have that be repeatable and deterministic. You don't want to miss out on making money. And then one that I don't think about very much, but you two were kind of going over, is it's almost like it's like two sides of the same thing. Like finance wants to have, or finance would like to have, options, like optionality. When things change, they can like put something on pause or spend more, which also implies they have controls. Like they can actually, like, having an option without being able to do anything about it is annoying. It's more stressful, right? And so they need those controls that they can go in there. And then the other side of that, which I'll have to think about some more, but I think it's something that we should work on in an industry, is not only like speaking the language of finance, but like y'all were saying, we should just speak to them like at the end of the cycle, and then also know how to show the as you were saying, I think it was you, Brian, the value that got delivered, right? And so like I think intuitively, like if we build out a platform and the middleware and all this stuff, like we understand the value that was achieved, but like it's hard to like you have to express that to people, right? You have to say that, and it takes a certain amount of meeting each other in the middle about the technical parts of it, right? Like you've got to get somewhere beyond like, I don't know, I just bought you a bunch of computers. Why isn't it working? And you have to say like, well, let me tell you how that works, right? And why investing in this cloud native way of doing stuff, just as an example, was better than this other way of doing it, even though it's just computers or something like that. But I don't know. I don't know what the further delve into that is, but I think as y'all two are getting to, it's just sort of like a misunderstanding, not even a misunderstanding, just not knowing how each side works and having different expectations for it, which I think is helpful. Well, speaking of being helpful, we should let Mike get on to the other helpful things he does rather than entertaining us. Like it was great to go over this stuff. It was really nice that you know, Brian's been working with you and he thought to bring you on here, so that's good. And I think your willingness to come on is always great, because I find that people in your position don't always share with the rest of the community what's going on. You know, if only because they got other stuff going on. But thanks a lot for going over that. That was great. If is there anything you want to if people are interested in more that you would point them to? Any things like that?
I mean, I'm always happy to talk about any of this sort of stuff. DevOps, cloud, software engineering, give me a shout on LinkedIn. I've got no ulterior motive in terms of hiring anybody, so it's a great conversation. Yeah, thanks to both of you as well after me. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Well, as always, this has been Tanzu Talk. You've either watched a video of this, or you've downloaded a podcast, or perhaps one of your parents or someone in your house is listening to it while they're making a meal, and you're thinking, what is this? You're being subjected to it from the kitchen. But if you want to get the show notes from this, we'll put any relevant links. You can go to tanzutalk.com and find out how to subscribe to the podcast if you prefer audio, find the videos, things like that. And as always, thanks, and we'll see everyone next time.